What we're going to talk about today is really what I'm calling UX guardrails for AI. And this is something that I've learned kind of over the last amount of time. I won't say how long that I've been working as a product manager, product ops person. I've even dabbled in the dark arts of business development occasionally. But right now, I'm a product operations manager at GitHub. I was just at Google in the core machine learning group. At Cognizant, I focused a lot on product management and AI work. At Meta, I worked on the Portal device, which we're actually going to talk about a bit today. And then at Microsoft, I've done a lot of different things, but mostly in consumer space down the Silicon Valley campus. And so I have a lot of different experiences, as you can tell, within the realm of product management. But I think I've really thought an awful lot about, as AI and machine learning has started to become a valuable part of products and services, what does it mean for us to actually create not only the right type of user experience and the right types of products that leverage that user experience, but also just how do we start to even specify what is the behavior that is appropriate for this whole product and this whole system that includes machine learning or non-deterministic systems. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And also I want to talk about that I'm going to be teaching a course that is actually 4 weeks long, where there's going to be lecture and live workshop components and then projects, where we'll be talking about just in general, like design patterns that people should be using for AI and machine learning products today and products that include those types of things. I think what's really important about this is that we will, part of this guardrail discussion we're going to have today ends up being related a lot to the ethics, bias, and fairness within machine learning. But I think there's a lot of things just about like interactions, trust, interpretability, even the idea of just how do you start to work in cross-functional teams with other people, I think ends up being really important and even more important when it comes to these types of technologies. And so it's a very hands-on course. It's a couple hours per week commitment. And then if you do want to sign up today or in the next 72 hours with this code here for UX Guardrails 10, not only will I give you 10% off, but I'm happy to do a 30-minute one-on-one coaching session with anybody here. And so, that can help maybe contextualize the way that you not only apply the patterns to your own work, but just really any questions you have about that. So I'll mention this, the code again at the end, but I wanted to at least let people know that I'm kind of creating a whole course around this. And this is like a little taste of kind of the types of things that we'll talk about during that course. So when we start to talk about like AI, there's a lot of things that can be under that umbrella, right? I think people talk about AI as if it's some type of monolithic thing that just is one thing that ends up being one thing that you interact with in a certain way. They tend to personify it a lot, when the reality is there's lots of different things that we mean when we say AI. We could mean something as simple as like a spell checker or autocomplete, and it could be something more complex, like a lot of the large language models that we have today that end up generating very interesting text and or images or even videos or 3D models or entire interfaces. So I think it's important for us to ground this inside of certain types of applications. And the particular grounding I want to do is a product that I worked on when I was at the Facebook Reality Labs, aka Meta, which was called the Portal device. And the Portal device was a video calling device that could sit on your shelf or counter, kind of these picture frame-like devices that you can see here. But it could also be on your TV. And what really ended up being important about those devices, or at least what I started to work on, were some of these concepts around, because we have a front-facing camera, can we do things that maybe would recognize a person and then personalize it for them? And so this is very similar to if you use like a Google Home Hub. This is a Google Home Hub Max, and this is a review from the a review of the device. You can kind of see in the center here, there's like a little icon for the person. And so what Face Match does within the Google Home Hub is it actually looks for someone that has opted in to the device to have their face tracked and identified. And then from that perspective, they will then personalize things like there's the For Your Morning pane right here, but it could be what are your meetings that are coming up during the day, and could do a bunch of different things. And so that's really what we're talking about today, is this idea of not only kind of face detection, which is a particular type of machine learning vision problem, but also identification, which means that you are, first of all, detecting faces within the room, and then you're doing something like taking the different faces that are there and then trying to match it to a library of faces that you have, which are usually called like face templates, and then being able to identify those and do something. And so in this case, what we would talk about when it came to face matching, it would basically, there was a mode for the device where it was anybody could walk up and use it. And so there was more of this concept of like a household, like what would it mean for a very low security, low privacy type of setting, right? And when you actually get your face matched, that would be where you could then like form the experience to that particular person's experience. You would personalize it, so that could be as simple as news, or maybe their Spotify playlists, or even the idea of calendar events, or even contacts that only they are allowed to call. And then there are other types of privacy and security changes that end up happening, because some things, say, the ability to send a message or start a phone call to certain people, may be protected in some way. And so this was kind of not exactly a full login or authentication, and that's like a different terminology within the identity world. But this is kind of like a halfway in between, where we wanted to give you a little bit more to be able to interact with the device, but we didn't want to necessarily like open everything up that may require like a passcode or actually a full login or something through like a secondary device like your phone. So that was kind of the goal of this, was to help personalize the device, really. That was the key thing, but based on the fact that you could just walk into the room and it would be personalized for you. And some of the questions that started to come up, and this was maybe where I had a learning experience working with not only machine learning researchers, but also machine learning engineers and other types of engineers, was when I would start to ask questions or start to specify what we actually had to do for this particular product, I would start asking things like, what is the minimum number of pixels for a face to be detected and identified? And unfortunately, this could be different on every device, because each one had a slightly different camera. They may have slightly different firmware that provides different ways that camera may provide or create imagery. And it was very technical. It was getting too far into the weeds. Or like, what is the minimum number of lumens required for this to work? And lumens are basically like a measurement of light. And so how bright or dark were we able to work? And again, this could be part of the camera specifications. It could also be part of the way that we end up capturing the face in the first place. It could have a lot to do with the way the model actually is parsing the video feed, whether it's still images versus like multiple still images, things like that. And then finally, when we start to talk about like fairness, what is the acceptable minimum accuracy for something where we had, say, a set of different skin tones for people? What is the minimum that we are allowed to have across all of these? And using something like an accuracy measurement ends up being highly technical, but it doesn't actually talk about maybe the harms that would happen to people or the way that they may be impacted by something like this. So these are all questions that I started to ask, but actually were probably the wrong questions to ask as a product person. And so from there, I started to realize that there were better questions, that we actually wanted to have a cross-functional discussion between me as a PM or as an experience designer and the actual kind of people that were building the products, like ML engineers, ML researchers that were maybe training specialized models, things like that. And so, how often can we not identify someone that's in the system that won't be annoying, right? Like, when is the false negative acceptable? And what are those like ratios? Like, how often, if I came to the room and every single time, that would probably be very bad. But like, could we do it like 1 in every 20 times? Would that be acceptable? We don't know. The next question might be like, how often can we mistakenly identify someone as someone else, if ever? And so, the thing that's interesting about households is that people end up living with people that usually they're related to, so they tend to look more alike with each other. And so how often is acceptable for someone that is similar looking, like especially twins, for example, for us to do this? And so that's like a very interesting question that we need to start talking about the experience itself and what the expectations of the technology are. And then if we have certain levels of kind of false positives, as we may want to call this as well, like what is actually acceptable for us to expose as far as risk with regards to access? And then what are the expectations of other people that are in the room? Because even though I may enroll into this service, there may be other people in the room that are not actually part of the service. They could be family members that don't want to be enrolled. It could be family members that can't be enrolled, like children, for example, that may not be able to actually, accept a terms of service, or maybe just like dinner party guests or people that come in to fix something. Those are all different people that are going to be inside this environment that could actually be detected, but maybe shouldn't be identified in some way. And then finally, what are the harms that with people like different types of faces based on this performance? And when I say different types of faces, I not only mean skin tone, but I also mean, say, beards, facial tattoos, eyeglasses, hats. There's a bunch of things like that that we start to think about, like what are the ways that we need to adhere and actually help people inside the household do the things that they want to do. And so, this then starts to take us through this idea that, like, usually the way that people build products today is like, yeah, there is the possibility for doing things that are either agile or waterfall or gated. But the truth is that we still need to be able to, like, specify what is the behavior we expect in some way. And so that specification of behavior usually ends up coming through in either documents like PRDs or specifications, maybe work items or user stories with acceptance criteria. But I felt that there was like there wasn't like quite the right way to write requirements for these types of experiences based on at least the way that I like experienced this with the portal. And so from that, maybe the precursors that we need to have here first, right? I always like to say that we can try to create things in a vacuum, but we will not create things that are actually ideal for our customers or for the business itself. And so from that perspective, before we get into like what we actually need to do to specify a machine learning product, I do want to say that usually we need to include what are our organization's values and strategy. And if you end up taking the course, we do talk a lot about values and the way that those values end up being included in the way we end up making ethical and moral decisions within the application of machine learning. And there's a really great team out of Google called Moral Imaginations, and they wrote a paper that I'll be providing as part of this course. It's available on the internet, but we'll be actually doing a Moral Imaginations workshop to be able to apply those values. So I think that's incredibly important when we talk about this. The next thing is this concept of customer segments. And so who is the customer that we're actually looking for and trying to help in some way? And we want to not only identify primary customers, like in our case, that might be a person that gets enrolled, that wants to have a personalized experience on the device, but also secondary ones. That could be people that are just in the household or people that are visiting the household. And we may even want to have other types of like anti-personas within there. And again, personas have like a kind of a rocky place within today's world because some people really love thinking about and talking about them. Some people think that they're applied poorly in some ways. And so I just say, like, whatever the way that you end up doing customer segmentation and using that as kind of a model for how you make decisions, that's really important. And then finally, we always need to really focus on what the problem is that we're solving for people. And so in this case, it was creating a device that was more personalized for them. And then from there, that ends up leading to what I usually think of as part of a specification. And inside of Google, especially, we would talk an awful lot about there's a product, right, which is the highest level of the hierarchy in some way. We then start to have these things that are called critical user journeys. And these critical user journeys are things that are really important to the experience, that we want to make sure that we not only get right from an experience standpoint, but that we want to then track and actually understand how people are doing inside those experiences. And then inside each one of these journeys, there's actually critical moments where something may happen. And we want to make sure that as part of that critical user journey, that critical moment is something that takes place in a way that is helpful for the customer, actually, maybe makes them feel the types of feelings that we want them to feel and not cause errors that could actually turn them off of the entire experience in some way. And so from there, a team, so the People Plus AI guidebook that came out of Google, I think in 2017 was the first edition. I helped, before I left Google, prepare for the next version of this. And one of the things that came out of this work through that team that's really amazing, again, I was just a contributor. I did not, by any means, create the whole thing. I was like a very small contribution, but it was one that I think was really interesting around how do we start to build these types of policies rather than requirements to have those conversations between technical people and non-technical people. And technical people, again, being ML engineers, ML researchers, even just regular engineers, data scientists, but then also the non-technical people like product managers, designers, interaction designers, motion designers, et cetera, et cetera. And so from that, there's this concept of interaction design policies. And for each of these critical moments, there's really like 4 things that we need to start to think about, which is, what is an acceptable action, right? An acceptable action is one that we want someone to take with our software or product or service. And we want to talk about what is the acceptable response from that type of machine learning model or product. There's unacceptable actions, which are the things that we don't want people to do. And we actually don't want to then have a response that would interact with that, or types of responses that we may get from the system that are actually bad for that person. There's thresholds of uncertainty, and those thresholds end up being where there may be, because of non-deterministic behavior, there may be an output that is not as helpful, and maybe is not really an error, but something where it's not exactly right. And so where are those cases, though, that people will be okay with that type of behavior? And so a good kind of like example of this might be when you're asking for imagery to be generated from a prompt, right? You usually will get a couple different versions of that, especially from like Midjourney. ChatGPT doesn't do that as much. They tend to give you one at a time unless you ask for more. But like getting a bad picture back or one that is not exactly what you wanted is probably okay, because then you can iterate with the system to be able to create the what you want. And then vulnerabilities ends up being really, where are there harms that could take place that would be bad for people? And that could be because you end up creating biased content that's negatively biased, because it is actually creating unfair situations, and it's creating other types of harms. And so how do we actually outline the types of things that the system could potentially do that would be bad? And so, for example, if someone asked for a particular type of picture and it gave something that was very inappropriate, right, that would be a vulnerability that we'd want to talk about in this case. So when we talk about that and we maybe contextualize this to the portal device, I think, you know, the way we should start to talk about this, especially for when we talk about not only detection, but identification of people to then personalize the device for them. Some of the acceptable actions, and by the way, I'm using enrollee as really kind of a short term for a person that has an account with a face profile, just to be very specific. But so like detecting various faces in the room, that would be acceptable actions, right? We would understand that there's other reasons why we may want to detect faces, like framing everybody in the same place, even if they don't have an account, for example. We want to be able to correctly identify the enrollee from detected faces. So if, we want the basic behavior that you get detected and identified and we personalize. We do not want to identify non-enrollees though. Right. This is something where you could put it as an acceptable action or as like another one, but I put it here because I think it's a positive one, that we're actually showing that we're not identifying people because they had not enrolled yet. And then we also don't want to, we want to hide sensitive data that is for those enrollees, but we want to be able to show it if that person deems it acceptable. And we would talk about this as like reading the room. Like, I will not ask for a bank account balance to be put up on my TV if there's other people there, but I might do it by myself. And so it's up to me as the person who's enrolled and has access to that information to decide whether I want to make a request that may be more sensitive. But we want to service that request if they do actually ask it. For unacceptable actions, things where we don't want people to ask and we don't actually want the system to respond, we don't want to misidentify enrollees, right? We don't want to automatically enroll people without their consent. We shouldn't just start the process because we see a face. We shouldn't show sensitive data when identifying an enrollee, but they haven't requested it yet. Like they haven't read the room, they haven't decided to actually bring up some sensitive data. We should put a barrier on that. We talk about thresholds of uncertainty, right? Things that we may want to, we don't necessarily want to happen, but is probably okay with people if they happen. So if we detect non-human faces, so like pictures or paintings, this is an error that is actually very hard to correct and requires something that's usually called proof of life, and is very much related to the way that kind of anti-spoofing and anti-deepfake kind of models end up working. What's really interesting about this is that it probably is okay that if there's a life picture and I detect it as someone, that is probably okay. Identifying them, maybe not so much. We should also not detect any faces due to the environment. So what I mean by this is that we should not see faces where there are no faces. Pictures and paintings, probably not, but detecting faces in the environment itself that are outside, that's probably still okay. It's probably not ideal, but it's something that would be okay. And we don't want to identify enrollees if we're not confident. So it's okay that sometimes enrollees, if they are too far away, their face is turned to the side, the light is too low, that we just don't identify them. It's probably okay that that happens occasionally. And then allowing someone else to use the device actually while the enrollee is identified is also probably not exactly ideal because they would have the personal context on that. But because that person is in the same room as that other person, that is probably acceptable in this case. And again, this could be something that as you start to create these types of policies, you could have this type of discussion. And then finally, like vulnerabilities that we would talk about would be one, accessing highly sensitive data when not asked by the enrolled person. So just showing my personal calendar or my email or doing something else like that, like bank account balances, that would be very bad. And then not detecting people in a way that they look differently than the stereotypical, white clean shaven face with no glasses and no tattoos. And so we want to make sure that the biases that end up being inside of these models are something that we think and talk about as far as vulnerabilities and from an unfairness standpoint. So having this kind of like structure around these 4 different design policies, we end up having a better conversation with engineers about what are the trade-offs we need to make here between all these things and what things are maybe acceptable and definitely not acceptable. And so from there, this then turns into a set of CUJs that list critical moments and their trade-offs. And if you're interested, I put together like a really simple example of this as like a PRD template. And again, feel free to use this. I put a lot of links to the content around the pairs guidebook, and I will link to the lightning talk from there as well. But really this idea of just like, rather than creating a bunch of hyper detailed specs that are very much about requirements, we're talking about policies to then start that conversation with engineers and ML researchers. And so this leads you to those better conversations. And that's something that I think, as part of this discussion, I'd love to open up the questions right now. And if people want to maybe just raise their hand and we can start to talk through that. I do want to just remind everybody that, again, like if you want to dive into these topics more, you want to do some hands-on workshops with regards to this type of thing, I'm offering a course. Again, it's 4 weeks, a few hours per week. And then if you sign up today, I'll give you 10% off and a 30-minute coaching session, just to really talk about whatever you're interested in talking about. So with that, I would love to hear if there's any questions about this, if people heard about this before, have they tried it out? Will they try it out? I'd love to hear that. I'll actually look at chat too, see if there's any questions. Yeah, and to be clear, the Moral Imaginations team at Google, there's a archive paper that if you look up Moral Imaginations, I believe it's a longer title, but I can also share that out with this. But that's the paper where they talk about this particular methodology. And let's see here. Yep. Oh, thank you for posting the link to the design policies article on Medium. And I think it's an amazing methodology. So I definitely have everybody check it out. And many thanks to the People Plus AI guidebook team at Google, because they really kind of like pioneered this. And one of the things that I did help work through this a little bit was thinking about, for some of the example products that we might use inside of that guidebook, how might we create design policies for the different ways that you can interact with these things. So that's kind of the way that I ended up really learning about this model and trying it out. And so yeah, that is that's the paper that Mary just posted. So if people are interested in that, please do check it out. Yeah, so any questions people have? Feel free to shout, just say it out loud if you do have any questions. Or put them in chat too if you don't feel comfortable. Oh, okay. So how does AI change the designer PM relationship? So yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. The way that I think of designers as working with PMs, I think of PMs as being really customer obsessed and focused on how do we kind of, deal with the uncertainty of the world? How do we end up helping with decision facilitation? How do we help build alignment and communication? And in general, just like, how do we balance those trade-offs between all of the stakeholders that we may have: design, engineering, legal, security, privacy. And so I think, from the standpoint of this like AI, I think the designers are still there to build the best experiences for that customer so that they can achieve the thing that they need to achieve. The PM is to make sure that we're balancing that against business interests or needs, how value creation happens, what are the technical trade-offs with the engineering team. And so I think design and PM still work the same way. I just think that there's like better ways to have those conversations, and that's something that we'll go into in the course. But I think that's why these design policies are super interesting, is that it's really all about this idea of how do you create a framework that a product person could put together, what are kind of these different policies that may exist, and then how do they have those conversations with the designer in some way. And then, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to miss you, Hani. How are you thinking about design policies around hallucinations with generative AI? So that I think this is actually the key part of why the vulnerabilities and the bad part of this actually exist, right? So if we have like, if we go back here, there are things about hallucinations that will fit in all of these places. So hallucinations, right? If we really want to talk about them, what they end up meaning is something that is not expected, right? And usually we consider hallucinations to be bad, but inside of the world of creative writing, for example, or creating a brand new thing from an image from a prompt that you want to be very imaginative, it's no longer a hallucination, it's actually part of the functionality. And so I'd say that like when we talk about this concept of like acceptable actions, we may want that for like a very imaginative prompt that we want to create lots of different things that we didn't expect, for example. When it comes to unacceptable actions, we may not want for our service, right, our hypothetical image generation service to create things that are pornographic, things that are violent imagery, things that are CSAM, like all these different things. We may not want people to actually ask that, and we will also not want to give that as response. When it comes to thresholds of uncertainty, there may be cases where hallucinating a little bit, where we're getting a little bit off track, right, that the person would be okay with that, but they're willing to then do the next prompt to be able to ask and get it back on track in some way. And then vulnerabilities, this is where, I think Google is in a very interesting place with their image creation, because are these image generation generative services used to create historically accurate pictures, or are they there to create pictures that are imaginative and diverse? And they're trying to do both, and it's very hard to do both. And so I think this is where vulnerabilities, as a person that would be a PM for that type of service, you have to decide which of these things are actually harms to people or not. And so that's the way I would start to think about this like idea of generative services, is that there are actually aspects of hallucinations that fit into any one of these things, and will depend on what problem you're actually trying to solve. If you're creating like a creative writing assistant, hallucinations are good, actually. If you're creating something that's trying to create accurate summaries of journals and other types of web content, hallucinations are bad, right? If you're trying to do things like education and creating quizzes on the education, probably hallucinations are bad, right? Other than when you're trying to generate bad answers, right? For people to critique. So again, this is why I think this model is so unique, is that when you start to look at it, you can then do very interesting things when it comes to, for your particular problem that you're trying to solve, what are the acceptable, unacceptable, uncertain, and kind of vulnerable situations that people may be in. And yes, actually, your brain also hallucinates a lot of time. But that doesn't mean, though, that we want to build products that cause harm, right? That's always the important thing to say. So great. Sao, I think you had Daniela. Have you implemented any policies that turned out to be unsuccessful? So I think this is a fairly new technique. And so what I would say is that the ones that I created for the portal device, the ones that were unsuccessful in this particular way, I would say were similar questions we started to ask, was really about how complicated people would be willing to understand this type of identity switching around. And in the end, I think the right answer is that we should build these devices to have less identification and more I guess the identity that we start talking about here is actually the household, not the person, because these are public devices, they're communal devices usually. And so if you're not a person that lives by yourself and you have other people just randomly coming along, the stance should probably be more like it's a public communal device. And so an example of that could be, I just recently had to buy Spotify Family because I have kids, and the Google Home Hub that's in my kitchen, their requests for music are completely destroying my recommendations inside of Spotify. And so like from that perspective, I had to create a specific account that would then gather behavioral data around that family account rather than my account in particular. And so that's an example of where I think I kind of got it wrong. Like we're trying to make a lot about like account switching, when the reality is the identity is probably more communal than it should be. How do you plan and justify the resources required for these types of efforts? How do you get budget and people? Well, so I think like one of the things you should always keep in mind when it comes to the way that you plan these efforts is, especially with machine learning, there's an added variable that unless you're pulling the model out of an API or off the shelf, and you're maybe doing some minor fine tuning, there could be a lot of work and experimentation for model architecture, the right type of data, the amount of training and things like that. So I think like that ends up being an interesting question to start to talk about when it of trade-offs. And we'll talk a little bit about that type of thing inside this course, mostly in the introduction, when we talk about like the different nuances when we talk about designing these types of products. But I think that's a really good question. Let's see. Can you give a few more examples? And I know we're just about out of time. I'll answer this last question. Can you give some examples of critical user journeys and critical moments? So critical user journey usually ends up being really focused on the outcome that we're trying to get for that person. So in the case of, say, like in the article that that was posted about the design policies, Planerific is really trying to get you to have a successful event, right? And that success could mean a lot of different things. It could mean a very happy event if maybe it's a birthday or a party, but it could also be a sad event or a mournful one if it's a funeral. And so from that perspective, the thing that was really important was that, like, are we getting the right types of information from them? Are we providing them with the right possibilities? Are we also then, helping them kind of automatically manage things with regards to, say, vendors or questions from people? And so a lot of the critical like journeys there were about like, how do we get people to set up the thing? And then how do we get the experience of the guest or the other people that want to interact with the host, but just get answers from, say, like some type of like agent. Those were critical user journeys that we really wanted to focus on. And the critical moments ended up being around those design policies where both really good and really bad outcomes could happen depending on how we built that. So with that, thank you very much for everybody being here. I really appreciate all the great questions. This will be posted, the video. And then again, if you're interested in taking this course, we'll be going really in depth in a lot of these types of topics and actually doing hands-on workshops like empathy mapping for the machine, moral imaginations, things like analogous, like analogy mapping for technology. There's a bunch of different things that we're really going in depth that help you have better conversations and actually build out well-designed products that enable AI and machine learning models. So anyways, with that, thank you so much, everybody. We'd love to connect, and thanks again.